Well, Steve, I have a question. What do you do if you have a group of people that have been following God and suddenly they go way off track?
I liked how you put it a couple of sessions ago. You said we're going to get to chapter 32, and you said that's where Israel goes off the rails and they crash and burn.
That's right, because that's what's going to happen today on Reasoning Through the Bible. Today, we've been following Israel in Egypt, and as they came out of Egypt and they've gotten the 10 Commandments, and after they've seen all of the things that God has done, today they start worshiping a golden calf. And this is a rather famous or infamous scene where they, again, go way off the rails. And it sort of leaves you scratching your head. How could a people that have seen so much get so off track?
This is a perfect example of when Paul talks about that the nation of Israel was given to us as an example. And that we see that through this. The great question is, how is it that a people that have seen God do all of these miracles, how is it that they can get to a point that they, in essence, turn their back on him? And the leadership goes along with it. So we're going to see a lot of different things today. Mob mentality, a small faction that affects the leadership. There's just so many rich things that are in this session today.
So if you have your copy of the Word of God, turn to Exodus chapter 32. And we'll be starting there. Just a bit of review. Israel was in slavery in Egypt, and God did miraculous things. Remember the 10 plagues? And that showed God's superiority to all of the false gods of Egypt. Then he had this very dramatic scene on Mount Sinai with the lightning and the thunder and the earthquakes, showing that the giving of the law was rather spooky and scary. Then we had, of course, the 10 Commandments and all of the picture of salvation and separation of sin that was in the tabernacle. All of this was being given to Moses as he was on Mount Sinai. And he was up there for 40 days. Now in Exodus 32, we find out what happened to the people that were down at the foot of the mountain as Moses was on Mount Sinai. So Steve, if you could start in Exodus 32, start at verse 1 and read the first 8 verses.
Now, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people assembled about Aaron and said to him, "Come, make us a god who will go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." Aaron said to them, "Tear off the golden rings which are in the ears of your wives, your sons and your daughters, and bring them to me." Then all the people tore off the gold rings which were in their ears, and brought them to Aaron. He took this from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made it into a molten calf. And they said, "This is your God, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt." Now when Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord." So the next day they rose early and offered burnt offerings and broke peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and to drink and rose up to play. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, "Go down at once, for your people, whom you brought from the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves. They have quickly turned aside from the way which I commanded them. They have made for themselves a molten calf and have worshipped it and have sacrificed to it and said, 'This is your God, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt.'"
So with this, we have Israel, again, has been waiting down at the foot of the mountain as Moses has been at the top. They've corrupted themselves. They very quickly turn from the way of following the true God, and they build this idol, this golden calf. Let's kind of go back through this and look at this verse by verse. If we look at verse 1, it says that now when the people saw Moses delayed, so the people were impatient. They thought that God should be moving quicker. Things ought to be happening faster. The mountain was covered in smoke and fog and thunders and things. And I'm sure they got to wondering, wow, what happened to this guy Moses? He's gone off, and they got tired of waiting. So here's a question, Steve. Why is it hard for people to wait on the Lord? Why is it hard for us to wait and do things in God's timing?
It's a nature that we have, that we want things to happen now. We want things to happen on our time. we want things to happen for us. It's a selfish type of feeling many times. It's, I think, a basic human trait that we have.
I think you're exactly right. We want God to work on our schedule and not on his. It's a very selfish thing to do. We're expecting God to move, and how come he hasn't moved when I thought he ought to move? When really he's the wise one, and we need to do things on his schedule. Now, in this passage, Aaron didn't push back on the people. In fact, he just sort of followed the crowd. They came to him and said, let's make an object, an idol, and he went along with it. It's very difficult sometimes to stand alone when the crowd is going a whole nother direction. So here's the next question. What do we do if we wake up one day and everybody around us is worshiping an idol? What do we do?
I think that's actually gets to the crux of this. This is in the midst of, they're still getting manna from heaven every day. They're still getting the quail in the evening time while all this is going on. So God is still providing for them while they're doing this. We're also going to see later that it's really a smaller faction, because we mentioned that there's 1.5 million, estimated 1.5 million to 2 million people that have come out of Egypt. And we see later on when God deals with it that it turns out to be a small faction that is doing this. It's not everybody that's participating in this. And Aaron is allowing, as a leader, he's allowing this smaller group of people that we get a sense that they're into like a mob mentality. He doesn't know what's going to happen to him, but he allows the smaller faction to dictate to him what he's going to do. And especially Aaron, after seeing all the things that God has done, he's been right with Moses, and God has actually used Aaron in some of the miracles that happened. For him to allow these people to dictate to him what to do is really something. To answer your question, what should we do whenever a mob is going a different direction, a different way from God, and what should we do? The answer is we need to stick with God. That's what we should do.
We need to be ready and think through these things in advance. What would I do if everybody around me gave up on the Lord? If I was the only one and everyone around me stopped following the Lord for whatever reason and went another direction, what would I do? And we need to be ready to hold fast with our faith, even if the crowd goes in another direction. Because that's what happened here to Aaron. Everybody around him was coming and pushing on him, saying, oh, we have to do something different. This Moses and this Yahweh God are gone now, so we need another one. And we need to hold faithful to the Lord, even if everyone around us is not. How long had it been at this point since all those miracles? Remember the 10 plagues and all crossing the Red Sea? And how long had it been at this point in the story?
This is only about 2 to 3 months time since this has happened, so really not that long.
Had Israel seen enough evidence that they should have known God's gonna be faithful, he hadn't forgotten us after he'd done all of this, should they have known? Had they seen enough evidence?
They absolutely have seen enough evidence, which brings into another curious factor. Today in our times, we have skeptics and scoffers that talk about, oh, if God would only show himself to me and give me proof that he exists, then I would believe. Look at everything that they have seen, and they're still getting provided for by God, and here they want to go and worship another God.
Right. Think of all these things these people have seen. Sea parted, food raining down from heaven, the demonstration of the true God 10 times against all these false gods. There was things that happened to the Egyptians that didn't happen to the Israelites in the land of Goshen. And they had seen all of these things, and here they are a very short time later, just abandoning God. We'd never act like that in our day, would we? I mean, of course, we should ask ourselves the same question, which is, how come I doubt God? in such a short amount of time. It's easy to point fingers back here to the ancient Israelites. Oh, only been 2-3 months and they're so quickly falling away. How quick do I fall away and don't follow the Lord? I've had all this time, all these years to study the Word of God, and it's right here written down right here in front of me, which is more than what they had. And I so quickly fall out of the way. How come I fall out of the way so quickly?
When I mentioned before that I was happy to get to this section, it wasn't because I'm happy to look at and study what Israel did. It's because it makes it clear to me. I was at a point in time in my life whenever I did stray away from God. And it's just a picture of human nature. It's the picture of how humanity is that even when God provides for them, they do have a tendency to go off. Now, I've gotten to a point where I no longer will do that because I've really committed my life to God. But we should ask ourselves, what are we going to do if a mob comes up or if everybody is going away from God? We should be prepared for that, because there are always going to be people around that are going to try and take us away from God. That is Satan's main objective, is to take us away from God and to deceive us, just like he did with Eve. He's still trying to do it today.
Right, still doing it today. And we've seen enough evidence where we ought to be able to trust God with what he says in the Bible. And just like the ancient Israelites, we should have known better. So moving on in the passage, here's the next question. Steve, Aaron made this, and he says he took an engraving tool and created it. Do you think the calf was made well? Do you think it was a nice, artistically beautiful object? Or was it an ugly old idol?
Well, you would think if he takes the detail to take an engraving tool, I mean, that leads you to believe that there was a lot of detail that was associated with it.
And the reason I ask that is because, is there a correlation between how beautiful an object of worship is and whether or not we ought to worship it at all? And I submit, just because something is a very beautiful religious object doesn't mean we ought to worship it or even venerate it. Just because something is made very well and made very beautifully, there's a lot of very phenomenally beautiful religious objects around the planet. Most of them we don't have any business falling down in front of. That's what I was kind of trying to get at here, is this calf might have been very, very beautiful. Still shouldn't worship it.
Aaron could have made something that was just kind of very basic. He didn't have to go to the trouble to get an engraving tool out to make it. He could have just made a quick mold, thrown something up there. I don't think it really mattered to the people. They were just wanting to worship another god. So it does bring into mind again, what is Aaron thinking? Why is he doing this? Why did he? It's like he went the extra mile to make it a beautiful object to worship.
So then look at the middle of verse 1. The people come to Aaron and say, "Come, make us a god who will go before us." Make us a god. So here's a question, Steve. How hard is it to make a god?
Not very. You can make a god out of anything.
I submit it's even easier than that. All you have to do is desire it. Remember, what was one of the 10 commandments? Do not covet. And the motivation for idol worship is coveting, is we want this thing. It's real easy to make a god. We can make a god out of all kinds of things. You can make a god out of yourself. You can make a god out of your own ambitions. You can make a god out of desiring money. You can make a god out of all kinds of things. It's real easy to make a god. You don't have to go to a craftsman to make one. The people come to Aaron, make us a god. And the passage doesn't tell us what's going through Aaron's mind. If we were in Aaron's shoes, what's going through your mind?
What's going through my mind is, what if I resist? If I resist this mob, what's going to happen to me? It's almost like we see Aaron here is in a self-preservation mode. I need to go ahead and comply with what they're wanting in order to protect myself. There's just a lot of curious things that are going on.
One of the curious things is they couldn't see Moses. They couldn't see Moses. They wanted something in front of them that they could see. That was the motivation for the idol, is we can't see this Moses, so make us something we can see. What is it about human nature that wants to look at a thing for us to worship? And see, we can't see God. He's invisible. He's not present to us. What is it about human nature? They said, we can't see Moses. Make us something we can see. We want something in front of us to look at that we can handle. What is it about human nature that wants to make a thing to worship?
I think it speaks to our five senses that we want to be able to see, touch, smell, because that's what grounds us into the world. And that's the key, though. It grounds us to the world. It doesn't necessarily ground us to the spiritual world on who we should be interested in. Another thing is that this is where it comes to play. We just went through 6 to 10 chapters of God laying out very specific ways of him to be worshiped. God has said two things. I'm the God that brought you out of Egypt, that he says over and over again, and I will be your God. And here, right away, they're going to attribute to this God bringing them out of Egypt and this God being their God. So the question, as we went through all of those chapters in very much detail over and over and over again, God says, I'm the God that brought you out of Egypt. I will be your God if you obey the statutes and commandments that I'm giving to you. Now we see why it has to be repeated. And I think that's another human nature, that we have to have things repeated to us because we have very short attention span.
I think both the scriptures and our human experience tell us that human nature has a bent towards idol worship. We as people have a bent towards idol worship, and that has to be pulled out of us. God has to drive that out of us because we're just like these people. And these people had this bent towards an idol. Make us a thing we can see. And I think humans are just like Christians are just like this. We want something in front of us that we can see. Here's a question before we get into the human nature part. God, of course, knew this was going to happen. Why do you think he allowed it? Why didn't he zap them, send a lightning bolt, and stop them from creating the idol? Because we're going to see some people die because of this. How come he didn't prevent it in the first place?
Because God desires to have people that want to worship him. He desires people to want to have a relationship with him. He gives people all the chances to do that. He could stop things, and sometimes he does. There's other times whenever he does it, and then the skeptic and scoffers, they end up complaining about that as well. But he really wants to have people on their own decide to worship him and come to him, have a relationship. And so by allowing them to do this, it also demonstrated to the greater group, we have this smaller faction that's out there that's given all this ruckus, that's stirring things up. And it's putting forth to them, what decision are they going to make? You mentioned it before. What are we going to do if the mob comes and starts going against God? It's allowed for various reasons, but I think one of the main reasons is for the other people, the believers that are out there. What are they going to do? Are they going to stay faithful to God and stay true to him, or are they going to abandon God with the mob?
This question gets into, okay, God knows they're going to do this, and yet he allows them to do it. We hold that God knows all things, and he's also all loving. So it begs this question, why would God allow this to happen, and then he punish them afterwards? Well, first of all, why questions with God are almost meaningless, because we don't know why. We don't even know why we do things, let alone why an infinitely wise being would do things. So the answer is we don't know why, and we're probably not going to know why all of things, because God is infinite, we're finite, and the finite will never understand the infinite. But what I can tell you is that any of these, okay, why did God do such and so questions, very often the people asking this are trying to put God into a no-win paradox. Because if you think about it, this happens frequently. If God were to have stopped them before they created the idol, then people complain and say, oh, God's not allowing human freedom. He's punishing people, innocent people before they committed an act. How come God doesn't allow people to do things? He's just a big divine bully. If he then does like he does here and wait and give them freedom to go commit evil and then deal with it, then they're saying, okay, how come God allows evil in the world and doesn't stop it? Well, you can't have it both ways. You can't have it where he does stop evil and doesn't stop evil, and I'm going to criticize him either path he takes. In the end, God's all wise, and we're not, and he allows things to happen, but in the end, he does what's right. We can just trust him with that. Moving on, look at the end of verse 5. If we look at the end of verse 5, we have something here very interesting. These are the people, and they've gotten Aaron to make this idol. And verse 5 says, now when Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, tomorrow shall be a feast to who?
The Lord, Yahweh.
So he's saying tomorrow will be a feast to Yahweh. So he created this idol, this golden calf, put an altar before it to make sacrifices to it, and said tomorrow there's going to be a feast to the Lord, to Yahweh. And again, whenever it says all caps, it's giving the name of God, Yahweh. I find this very interesting and very telling. Aaron was combining this object, this golden calf, and this altar he made with worship of Yahweh. And if you were to ask him and ask the people, oh, we're worshiping Yahweh. But later, what does God very clearly, as we're going to see before the end of the chapter, what does God call this?
Well, he says that the people have abandoned, he calls it idol worship. And he says that the people have abandoned he lays it on Moses and says, your people are down there and they have abandoned me and are worshiping another God.
So Aaron says, we're doing religious activity for Yahweh. This is for the real God. God says, no, you're not either. You're doing idol worship, and this should be cut out, and we're going to see what happens here. I bring this up because these people made this object because they wanted to see something. They want to see something that they can sit in front of and do religious activities. Aaron even says, okay, let's worship the real God here. And they've combined this veneration of this object with worshiping God. And God says, no, it's idol worship, and this needs to be completely cut out like cancer. I submit that today we have people in churches that are doing the same things. They're taking objects and they're saying, oh, we're not worshiping the object. We're doing worship to God here. This object just helps remind me of the one God, the one true God. When people did that here in Exodus, God came down very hard on that. And he said, no, that's idol worship. That's idol worship. So, Steve, what are your thoughts?
Well, the other thing that happens today is there's attributions that are giving to these statues that people do venerate or honor. They're asked to intercede for them for different activities. So it's not just them venerating the object and they're saying we're actually worshiping God, but honoring the object. They're going beyond it and actually asking what the statue represents. Many times it's a saint. They're asking the saint to intercede on their behalf to God. That's far, far beyond. It's not too far away from what they're actually doing here. They're attributing to this God, this idol, that this God brought them out of Egypt, when clearly it wasn't this God that brought them out of Egypt. They had just made the God. They actually physically made the God itself. And it clearly wasn't the God Yahweh that had brought them out of Egypt. To answer your question, it's not just the object itself. It's what are you doing? What is the expectation that you have behind the object? If you're asking for something, that object, that statue, that there's a saint behind it, or that there's something else behind it, and you're asking for them to intercede for you, in my opinion, you're doing the exact same thing that these people are doing. You're really not worshiping God. It's idol worship.
Notice here in the text, in this entire chapter of Exodus, nowhere in here does it say that these people actually fell down and worshiped in front of this idol. Nowhere does it say they worshiped in front of the idol. What it says is that we're going to have a feast to Yahweh. We created this object, very beautiful probably, very beautiful religious object made out of gold. We're going to have a feast to Yahweh, and we're going to have an enjoying religious activity here. God says, no, that's idol worship. You need to get rid of it. You've gone off track. We have people today that have done, as we've said here, with very good intentions. People today have taken relics, they've taken icons, they do religious activities in front of this, and they make a distinction and say, I'm not worshiping this object. We're venerating it, giving it honor, giving it high honor, but we're not worshiping it. And I submit that's exactly the same line of reasoning that the people here in Exodus did before the golden calf. The human tendency is we want an object in front of us. And God drives that all the way out. He repeats it coming up in the coming chapters. Do not make any, he says, molten image. But over in the Ten Commandments, don't make an image. The reason is because the human tendency is there to do religious activities in front of these and get our focus off of the real God that we can't see and onto this object. The human tendency today is just as bad as it was here in Exodus with the golden calf.
Can I add one other item to the listing that you made of items? Multi-million-dollar private jets.
Or multi-million-dollar church buildings that get our attention off of the Lord onto the building.
And that's why I wanted to mention it. There are ministers, and I'll use that word very loosely, that pride themselves on the multi-million-dollar jets that they have. And they initially go and ask their people to give so that they can have, and actually say, God has told me, the Lord has told me that he wants me to have this multi-million-dollar jet. He wants this ministry to have this multi-million-dollar jet. The people give to it, they get it, and then they fly it around for a few years, and then they come back and they say, oh, God has now told me that I need to have a bigger jet. And I mention this because I have actually seen them. They are very proud of it. They're proud of it. They're very open about it. They're very proud of saying God says he wants you to give to this. People give to it. So there's two things. One is the person themselves, the minister themselves. They have taken these multi-million-dollar jets, and it's become an object that they're attributing to God, but yet it's their own prideful thing that they have. It all ends up being in the same type of category, in my opinion, that becomes an idol as well. Opulence, not just the travel, but also with the multi-million-dollar facilities that are only open for maybe 1 day a week and not utilized the rest of the time. Other things as well. And again, we're not holding ourselves higher than anything else, but we are mentioning and giving cautionary tale that while this happened with the Israelites here, and it's a golden calf, that in our era, it's other things. It doesn't have to be just a golden calf. It can take form and shape in various items, and it's anything that comes between you and God. That's what needs to be cautioned against.
Before we got out of the New Testament, they were cautioning about that as well. In 1 John 5:21, keep yourselves from idols. The reason he had to command that is because the human tendency, even inside the church, was to move towards idols. A couple of more things. If we could turn to verse 4 real quick. There's a point here I want to make before we get out of this section. In verse 4, it says, he took this from their hand, this is Aaron, and fashioned it with an engraving tool, made it into a molten calf, and they said, this is the people of Israel, this is your God, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt. This is your God. So what were they doing? They were attributing the works of God to this object. They were saying, this is what brought you out of Egypt. Now, what was God doing with the 10 plagues. He was demonstrating what?
He was demonstrating to them his power and who he is. That's what he was demonstrating to
And
them.
his superiority over all other so-called gods. And what is the message that he keeps repeating and will continue to repeating? I am the one that brought you up out of Egypt. Again, what are they doing here in verse 4? This is the God who brought you up from the land of Egypt. So right there is God gets so emotional about this is because God did all these things to bring them up out of Egypt, and now they're attributing that immediately to this object. All of the demonstrations that God did, now they're attributing that to God. This is a great offense to God. When God does something in our lives, do we ever attribute it to something else? Because God does a lot of good things. And at the moment, oh, thanks God for doing that. Time goes by. What do we attribute it to? Oh, look at all what I accomplished in my life. Look at all the things I did. Look, well, wait a minute. Be careful. Don't attribute the things of God to yourself or to anyone else. Give God the glory.
And that's the practical part for us at our level. To us, it may be a car. It may be a car that we really can't afford. It may be a house that we really can't afford. And it could be that God has blessed us. There's nothing wrong that God blessing us. He certainly blessed me. But we need to always be cautious and we need to be careful. And we need to always give God the glory for the things that we have and not think that we got them on our own strength and not attribute them to us or to something else when it actually was God.
We're out of time for today, so we'll stop here. But there's still more great things to learn about the golden calf and lessons for us, because this section here has so many lessons for us. We're just like the ancient Israelites. So we trust that you'll be back with us next time as we continue to reason through the Bible.
Thank you for watching and listening, and may God bless you.